Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Shelly Swearingen, and if you've not been here before, welcome. You've picked a good one. Today we are doing the Are You Like Jane Austen quiz. And because I'm so nosy and curious about all of you, I am going to create this or turn this into a tag. So I'm going to tag everybody at the end. But really, if you make videos, I want to see you do this tag. As the name implies, I created a Jane Austen quiz. So basically, it's going to be seeing whether or not we are like Jane Austen. Let me back up a little bit. So at the end of June and the beginning of July, I found out about this epic booktube event named Jane Austen July. And basically, it's an event where readers submerge themselves in Jane Austen and her work and adaptations and so on. And I was really curious about this event. I actually made a whole video about my relationship with Jane Austen, and I will link that somewhere or put it in a card. But the short of it is that I didn't really like Jane Austen. And no matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't get into her. So I thought, if you don't like something, why not just dive right in and see if you like it? I don't know why I decided to do it, but yeah, my whole plan was to just dive right in and see if I like Jane Austen. And so what I did was that I read 2 Jane Austen books. I read a biography about Jane Austen, and then I read a historical fiction book about Jane Austen's life. And it worked out really well. So one of the things that I noticed was that the more I can identify with a writer, the more they are human to me, the more that I see their struggles and their humanity, the more that my heart opens to them, the more I am open to their work and to their writing. And so this actually happened with Jane Austen. I found out that her and I actually have a bunch of things in common and a bunch of things not in common. So I created a quiz that is 11 questions or 11 prompts. One can win 11 points, essentially, about Jane Austen. So I share a fact, and then I say, give yourself a point if, and then if you are like Jane Austen in that fact, then give yourself a point. I tried to be fair and not just choose facts that were that align with my life, and really I found her life quite fascinating. I used Claire Tomalin's book Jane Austen: A Life in order to compile these facts, and a lot of the information I have in this video is from her book, Claire Tomalin's book. So let's get into the video. Jane Austen is an artist. She is a writer. She had 6 novels published, and she also has a slew of short stories and some juvenile work. So she is definitely an artist. And surprisingly, what I didn't know was that she came from a family full of artists. They were all wordsmiths like her. Her mother was a poet. Her brothers wrote poetry and plays, and a lot of the women in their family corresponded through letters, which I think is an artistry in and of itself. So give yourself a point if you are a writer. Give yourself a point if you're also an artist. So 1 point if you're an artist and an extra point if you are a writer. I myself have dabbled in creative nonfiction writing. I have also dabbled in photography, painting, set making, puppet making. I made a small puppet for my children, and I typically have some sort of creative project going on at all times. So I definitely ID with this, and I am much like Jane Austen in this way that I myself create art. Jane Austen, she had a bunch of siblings. She was one of 8. She had a sister and 6 brothers. And so give yourself a point if you too have a lot of siblings. When I did some light web browsing about what would be a lot of siblings, I read that nowadays most people have 2 kids. And so a lot of the generation now is growing up with a single sibling. So I would say that if you have 2 siblings, that would be above average, and that 4 would constitute as a lot. Me, I get a point for this because I have 5 siblings. Yes, that's right, 5. I have 1 older sister, 1 younger sister, and 3 younger brothers. So there are 6 of us in total, and I wouldn't trade them for the world. So Jane Austen, she wasn't a fan of her formal education, and nobody really could blame her because in the 1780s, girls in boarding schools were really mistreated. They had to often share a bed, they were underfed, and they didn't get a formal education. A lot of times they were educated to do household tasks like sewing and knitting and things like that. So instead of learning mathematics and literature, she was learning the skills that she normally would just learn at home. So at 11 years old, Jane Austen's formal education came to an end. So give yourself a point if you also didn't like school. I can't give myself a point for this because I loved school. This is probably why I'm still a reader today. I love learning. I love exploring new worlds and new ideas and being introduced to them, along with many other things. And so yeah, I love school. Jane Austen was actually known for her dark sense of humor. This comes out in the characters she created, like Lady Susan Vernon, who is a despicable, vile character that is meant to be not liked at all. I also noticed this in Persuasion, not in the characters, but in the way that Jane Austen pokes fun at her characters through her writing and narration. That's how her dark humor really comes out, at least to me. So give yourself a point if you also have a dark sense of humor, but only give yourself a point if you're willing to share a piece of your dark humor in the comments below. I'm gonna give myself a point for this because actually I do have quite a dark sense of humor. My family reminded me of this over and over again while we were visiting them recently. So here's an example of my dark sense of humor. Maybe you won't find it that dark, but I think it's kind of inappropriate considering the context. When my husband and I were not husband and wife, and we weren't even friends, we were just co-workers. He was an assistant manager at Starbucks, and I was a lowly barista. And what I told him once was that every time a customer comes in, my heart breaks a little. I get a broken heart over a customer. That was my job at the time, was to serve customers coffee. And yet I was willing to tell my boss that I didn't even like serving customers. Yeah, I was quite melodramatic back then. Editing Shelly here, really quick. I asked my husband about my dark humor to see if I'm an unreliable narrator of my life, and he said, indeed, I am an unreliable narrator of my own life. He thinks that my humor isn't very dark, but I think that I have a dark streak, and I think that counts. Yeah, please share your dark humored jokes down below. Just don't, keep it nice. Jane Austen was actually proposed to twice in her lifetime and was engaged. She may have been proposed to more, but she was engaged rather twice. And both of the times she broke off the engagement. She chose a life of singleness. She chose a life of spinsterhood, which at the time wasn't necessarily a popular choice. She was devoted to her work and really decided to throw herself more into her work than becoming a mistress of a household. So give yourself a point if you are also single. I am not single. I have been married for almost 12 years now. And yeah, so I can't give myself a point for this. And for that, at least for me, I'm grateful. One of the most surprising facts that I learned about Jane Austen was that she actually struggled with mental health. There are mostly inferences to this, but the inferences are really strong. So from the ages of 25 to 35, she actually produced no work. Almost no work, pretty much no work. She fell silent is what Claire Tomerlin said. And this was after Jane Austen had completed 3 novels. After that 10-year period, she did pick up writing again and she did produce 3 more novels. But it was during that time that we can guess that maybe she had some bouts of depression. There are also letters that point to the fact that she didn't like to leave her bed for periods of time or even her room, that she wasn't feeling up for company, and that she really did struggle with feeling good every day. These periods of depression would come and go, and it is reflected in her work. Perhaps this is what contributed to her dark sense of humor. So give yourself a point if you yourself have had mental health struggles. I don't want to get into it on camera actually, but I have. And yeah, that's all I'm going to say is that I have. So Jane Austen in 1801 moved from Steventon to Bath. It was inspired by her parents. Her father was newly retired and they wanted a more relaxing setting, according to some research. Though there is also some research and some conclusions that could be made that the bout of her quiet time, the period of time where she produced little to no work between the ages of 25 and 35, that the move from Steventon to Bath actually contributed to that. And it's actually not surprising because Steventon was where Jane Austen grew up. It's where she made all those memories with her brothers and sister. And it was really truly her only home up until she moved. So I thought that was really interesting. Give yourself a point if you have moved away from your hometown or your home region. I grew up in California and I moved 3,000 miles away to South Carolina, which is a very small state, and it was very different and it was quite a challenge. I've been here for almost 11 years now. Actually, it'll be 11 years this month. So I've really gotten used to this place as home. I'm looking out to the greenery outside. It's so gorgeous here. And I really like where I'm at now, but at the time, it was quite the adjustment. Fashion. Jane, she was not vain, and actually she struggled to concern herself with things like fashion and design. According to Tomlin, Jane once wrote that, "I hate describing such things," she says of an ultra-fashionable borrowed cap she was to wear to a ball. So if fashion and design don't interest you, give yourself a point. For me, I can't give myself a point for this because maybe you can tell, but I kind of love fashion and design. It's one of my things, and I'm okay with that. On the subject of vanity, Jane Austen, she had opinions about her hair, mostly that she couldn't be bothered with it, which I actually really loved and was delighted to find out. So here's what Tomlin said about Jane. Jane chose to have her curls cut short at the front and leaving the hair at the back to pin up, tucking it into a cap when she felt like it, and making the whole process quicker and simpler. She had no need of curl papers. My hair was at least tidy, which was all my ambition, she wrote after a ball at Lord Portsmouth, suggesting she was unwilling to be too bothered. So give yourself a point if you too are unwilling to be too bothered about your hair. I'm quite unwilling to be unbothered about my hair, and I often, though I do it sometimes, most of the time I try and get it cut so I don't have to do hardly anything with it. Jane Austen, she also had opinions about the weather, like most of us. She didn't like the heat, and she actually wrote one of her most famous lines, or a really, really good line about the heat, which is, "What dreadful hot weather we have! It keeps one in a continual state of inelegance." And so give yourself a point if you also don't like the heat. Though I don't mind the heat, I am like Jane Austen. I think the weather is dreadful if it affects my appearance or makes me feel like a hot mess, or makes me feel inelegant. So I'm actually going to give myself a point. And here in South Carolina, I'm in a state of inelegance most of the time. All right, so how did you score? I scored 8 points, and here's how the scoring will go down. So if you scored from 10 to 11 points, or 10 to 11 points, the spirit of Jane Austen lives in you. She's with you day in and day out. If you scored 8 to 9 points, in another life, Jane Austen and you could be siblings, or at least good friends. This is where I scored. You two want to spend time with one another and work to make that happen. If your score was 6 or 7, then you and Jane Austen could be friends. You two could take a long walk in the country and chat about all the things that you have in common. If you scored 4 to 5 points, though you have less in common with Jane Austen than some, you could probably spend an afternoon chatting with her about your commonalities and your differences. If you scored 2 to 3 points, Jane Austen and you may not share much in common, but you two would be delighted to see one another at a social gathering, exchanging pleasantries about your different lives. And then if you scored 0 to 1, you and Jane Austen have a lot to learn from one another. And this could be shared over an afternoon cup of tea. All right, so to wrap up, I just wanted to say that Tomlin really made Jane Austen a very dynamic person for me. Before, Jane Austen was very flat, and I thought of her as sort of witty, snarky, and someone that I didn't share a lot in common with. And when I read Tomlin, the aspect of Jane Austen really filled out for me. She was somebody who had struggles, who had moments in her life that weren't great. And she made decisions in her life like turning down proposals in order to shape the life that she wanted. This was fascinating. It was enjoyable and intriguing, and it really helped grow my love for Jane Austen. All right, I'm gonna tag a bunch of people. This isn't a competition. This is just to see if you are like one of the most, beautiful and beloved writers of our time. So I'm gonna do this as quickly as possible, So I'm gonna tag Steve Donahue, Michael K. Vaughan, Kelly from Books I'm Not Reading, Brian from Bookish. I know you're not doing tags right now, but I would still love to see you do this tag if you are up for it. Miss Reads a Lot, Sandy, AJ Dunn Reads and Writes, Mark with Book Time with Elvis, Gina Stanier Books, This Just In, Bob the Booker, let's see, Jim's Books, Reading and Stuff, Spread Book Joy, Alice in the Giant Bookshelf, Aaron Facer. I've been loving Aaron Facer's all his little drawings. Very Literary Carrie, Rachel's Reading Nook, and Red Dot Reads. But of course, if you want to do this tag, then please do it. I would love to see you do it. And feel free to change, edit, adjust the questions as you see fit. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this one, and I really enjoyed making it. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you in my next one. Bye, guys.